Now let me introduce today's speaker. We're very fortunate, Henry Lowood, who has a PhD in history of science and technology and is currently the curator for the history, science, technology, film and media collection here at Stanford. It's a very long title, so he's responsible obviously for a lot. And so Henry has been involved with games for a very long time in various ways. And just to mention two things, one, he was very actively involved in the preservation of virtual world projects, which was basically initiated in order to, how do you archive video games, right? Like it's an important part of our recent history, and similar as we have old books in libraries and can still read them, how in a couple of years, centuries or whatever, can we play those games that have been developed in the past. And so Henry has been a big part of this. And he is also a co-editor of a recently new issued monograph series, which is called Game Histories. And he's done many other things in this space, and so very fortunate to have him here.
So this talks about game history, but probably not in the sense that you were expecting it. It's only partially about games. And also, I won't be speaking about history as events or as explanations, but about preparing to actually do history. Specifically, I'm going to talk about what we will do with collections of historical software, like game software. Let's begin with a question. When did libraries, archives, and museums begin to consider software as a collection object? My answer is in the late 1970s. The Charles Babbage Institute, CBI, and the History of Computing Committee of the American Federation of Information Processing Societies, that's a mouthful, AFIPS, which became a sponsor of CBI, were both founded in 1978. A committee at AFIPS then produced a brochure called Preserving Computer-Related Source Materials. It was distributed at the National Computer Conference in 1978, and it's the earliest statement I have found about software history collecting. It says in part, if we are to fully understand the process of computer and computing developments, as well as the end results, it is imperative that the following material be preserved: correspondence, working papers, unpublished reports, obsolete manuals, key program listings used to debug and improve important software, hardware and componentry engineering drawings, financial records, and associated documents and artifacts. Mostly paper records. The recommendations say nothing about data files or executable software, only mentioning the museum value of hardware artifacts for what they call aesthetic and sentimental value. We read also that artifacts provide, and I'm quoting, a true picture of the mind of the past, in the same way as the furnishings of a preserved or restored house provides a picture of past society. 1 year later, CBI received its first significant donation of books and archival documents from George Glaser, a former president of AFIPS. In the 1980s, history of computing collections meant documentation, such as archival records, publications, ephemera, and oral histories. While software preservation trailed documentation by a good 2 decades, the exceptional voice during the 1980s was David Behrman, who left the Smithsonian to create a company called Archives and Museum Informatics, AHI, in 1986. He began publishing something called the Archival Informatics Newsletter in 1987. As one of its first projects, this AHI drafted policies and procedures for what they called software archives. And they engaged in a project with the Computer History Museum, then located in Boston, around that time. By the end of '87, Behrman released the first important study of the preservation of software archives under the title Collecting Software, a New Challenge for Archives and Museums. Behrman alternated between frustration and inspiration in this report. Having conducted a telephone survey of companies and institutions, he wrote that, and I'm quoting him, the concept of collecting software for historical research purposes had not occurred to the archivists surveyed, perhaps in part because no one ever asked for such documentation. Nobody he spoke with said they were planning software archives. Undaunted, he produced a careful proposal proposing software collecting as a multi-institutional endeavor, drafting collection policies and selection criteria, use cases, a rough software thesaurus to provide terms for organizing a software collection, and a variety of practices and staffing models. Should an institution accept this challenge, here were tools for the job. Well, here we are nearly 30 years later. Software archives and digital repositories do finally exist. We've made great progress with respect to repository technology and collection development. Looking back to the 1980s, however, an issue raised first by the AFIPS brochure in 1978 persists. What is the relationship between collections of historical software and archival documentation about software history? Another topic that goes back to Behrman's report is determining use cases for software history. Who is interested in historical software, such as games? What will researchers do with game software collections? These kinds of questions prompt me today. Let me start by stating the obvious. Using historical software now, in order to experience it in 2015, and running that software in 2015 to learn what it was like when people operated it 30 years ago, are two different things. This will still be true in 2050. I'm almost embarrassed to make the point, but it's important to understand its implications. An analogy might help. Oops, I've been ignoring my slides. That was the newsletter, by the way, that I mentioned. An analogy might help. I'm not just talking here about the difference between watching Gone with the Wind at home on DVD versus watching it in a vintage movie house in a 35mm print, with or without a live orchestra. Rather, I mean the difference between my experience in a vintage movie house today, say in Oakland, when I can find one, and the historical experience of, say, my grandfather in Bremen during the 1930s. My experience is what it is, not what his was. With this in mind, I'll focus on the complicated problem of enacting a contemporary experience to reenact a historical experience, and what it has to do with game software preservation. I'll consider three takes. I will consider three takes on this problem: the historians, the media archaeologists, and the reenactor. Okay, take one, the historian. Historians enact the past by writing about it. In other words, historians tell stories. Just look at the word, history, right? This is not news. The last few decades of writing about the methods of history, that is about historiography, have been concerned with this question. Consider Hayden White, author of the much discussed Meta-History, The Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe, published in 1973. White tells us that history is less about subject matter and source material and more about how historians write. Now, historians do not simply arrange events in correct chronological order. Such arrangements White calls annals or chronicles. The work of the historian begins with the ordering of these events in a different way. Hayden writes in the content of the form that in historical writing, quote, the events must be not only registered within the chronological framework of their original occurrence, but narrated as well. That is to say, revealed as possessing a structure and order of meaning that they do not possess as mere sequence, end quote. So how do historians do this? They create narrative discourses out of sequential chronicles by making choices. These choices involve the form, the effect, and the message of their stories. White puts choices about form, for example, into categories such as argument, ideology, and emplotment. The result is sense-making through the structure of story elements, use of literary tropes, and emphasis placed on particular ideas. In a word, plots. This is the enactment of history as a form of narrative. In his book, Figural Realism, Studies in the Mimesis Effect, White writes about, quoting him, the events, persons, structures, and processes of the past that it is not their pastness that makes them historical. They become historical only in the extent to which they are represented as subjects of a specifically historical kind of writing. It's easy to take away from these ideas that history is a kind of literature. Indeed, this has been the most controversial interpretation of White's historiography. Well, my purpose in bringing Hayden White to your attention is to insist that there is a place in game and software studies for this historical kind of writing. I mean writing that offers a narrative interpretation of something that happened in the past. If any of you, Sorry, I'm skipping my slides here. If any of you have heard me use the following quotation before, because I use it all the time, I apologize, but that won't stop me from using it again here. It's a paraphrase of the line written by the late John Hughes and spoken by Steve Martin to John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. It goes like this. You know, when you're telling these little stories, here's a good idea. Have a point. It makes it so much more interesting for the reader. Game history and software history need more historical writing that has a point. Okay, allow me one last point about Hayden White as a take on enactment. Clearly, history produces narratives that are human-made and human-readable. They involve assembling story elements and choosing forms. How then do such stories relate to actual historical events, people, and artifacts? Despite White's fondness for literary tropes and plots, he insists that historical narrative is not about imaginary events. If historical methods are applied properly, the resulting narrative, according to White, is a simulacrum. He writes in his essay on the question of narrative in contemporary historical theory that history is, and I'm quoting him, a mimesis of the story lived in some region of historical reality, and insofar as it is an accurate imitation, it is to be considered a truthful account thereof. Let's keep this idea of historical mimesis in mind as we move on to takes 2 and 3. Take 2 is the media archaeologist. My second take is inspired by the German media archaeologist Wolfgang Ernst. As with Hayden White, my remarks will fall far short of a critical perspective on Ernst's work. I'm looking for what he says to me about historical software collections and the enactment of media history. Hayden White put our attention on narrative. Enacting the past is storytelling, or a kind of storytelling. Ernst explicitly opposes media archaeology to historical narrative. He agrees in Digital Memory and the Archive that narrative is indeed the medium of history. But he's after something else. He says, the technological reproduction of the past works without any human presence because evidence and authenticity are suddenly provided by the technological apparatus, no longer require a human witness, and thus eliminate the irony of the subjective perspective. Irony, by the way, is one of White's favorite tropes for historical narrative. White writes that historical enactment is a narrative mimesis. We imitate the past in some fashion. And its success is related to the correspondence of history to a lived reality. Ernst's riposte as a media archaeologist is enactment in the form of playback. In the essay, Telling versus Counting, a media archaeological point of view, Ernst works with the idea that to tell as a transitive verb means to count things. White versus Ernst here thus has to do in part with the difference between the German words erzählen, which means to narrate, and zählen, which means to count, or in English, to recount versus to count, okay? Ernst describes historians as recounters. He says, modern historians are obliged not just to order data as in antiquaries, but also to propose models of relations between them, to interpret plausible connections between events. In another essay, Ernst adds that histories of technology and mass media are textual performances that follow a chronological and narrative ordering of events. He observes succinctly that it takes machines to temporarily liberate us from such limitations. Where do we go with Ernst's declaration in Telling versus Counting that there can be order without stories? We go, of course, he would say, directly to the machines. For Ernst, media machines are transparent in their operation, an advantage denied to historians. We play back historical media on historical machines, and all of a sudden, the historian's desire to preserve the original sources of the past comes true at the sacrifice of the discursive. We are in that moment directly in contact with the past, according to Ernst. In Method and Machine, he moves forward the concept of media irony in response to White's trope of historical irony. Ernst says, media irony, the awareness of the media as co-producers of cultural content, is a technological modification of Hayden White's notion that every discourse is always as much about discourse itself as it is about the objects that make up the subject matter. Well, what does counting then tell us? As opposed to the recounting of history by historians, the counting of media archaeologists has to do with the encoding and decoding of signals by media machines. Naturally, humans created these machines, and this might be considered another irony, since humans have thereby created some sort of discontinuity with their own cultural regime. Playback replaces narrative by giving us direct access to the past, a past defined by machine sequences rather than historical time. That's media archaeology. Ernst draws implications from media archaeology for his concept of the multimedia archive. Now we're starting to come in, back into the archive. In Method and Machine, he says, with digital archives, there is in principle no more delay between memory and the present, but rather the technical option of immediate feedback, turning all present data into archival entries and vice versa. In Telling versus Counting, he talks about a truly multimedia archive that stores images using an image-based method and sound in its own medium. And finally, for the first time in media history, one can archive a technological dispositive in its own medium. That's what he says. Not only is the enactment of history based on playback inherently non-discursive, but the very structure of this historical knowledge will be inscribed by machines. Well, with this as background, we can turn to the concrete manifestation of Ernst's ideas as a collecting activity. The lab he has created in Berlin, and these images are from that lab, called the Media Archaeological Fundus, MAF. Its website describes the MAF as a collection of various electromechanical and mechanical artifacts as they develop throughout time. Its aim is to provide a perspective that may inspire modern thinking, quoting them here, about technology and media within its epistemological implications beyond bare historiography. Again, not just about storytelling, but about playback. Ernst adds that the MAF collection derives from the need to experience media in performative ways. It's an assemblage of machines that could be operated, touched, manipulated, and studied directly. As he stated in an interview with Laurie Emerson, such items need to be displayed in action to reveal their media essentiality. Otherwise, a medium like a TV set is nothing but a piece of furniture. And it's interesting that there he responds directly to that brochure I told you about earlier, from 25 years earlier, that artifacts are like the furnishings in a preserved house. Okay, the media archaeological take on enacting history depends on access to artifacts, and it's in its strong form on their actual operation. Even when media history is reduced to texts, these must be, quote, tested against the material evidence. This is the use case for playback as an enactment of software history. Okay, my third take is the reenactor. Is the reenactor. Well, authenticity is an important concept for digital preservation. A key feature of any digital archive over the preservation life cycle of its documents and software objects is auditing and verifying, combating bit and link rot, etc., etc. Access by researchers also involves authenticity. Any discussion of emulation or virtualization will bring up the question of fidelity to an historical experience of using software. John Walker of Autodesk and virtual reality fame created a workshop called Fermilab to work on personal projects such as an online museum celebrating Charles Babbage's analytical engine. This computer programming heritage work includes a Java-based emulator of the engine. And Walker says, since we're fortunate enough to live in a world where Babbage's dream has been belatedly realized, albeit in silicon rather than brass, we can not only read about the analytical engine, but experience it for ourselves. In an essay titled, Is the Emulator Authentic?, Walker says, in order to be useful, an emulator program must be authentic. There's that word again. It must faithfully replicate the behavior of the machine it is emulating. By extension, the authenticity of a preserved version of the computer game Doom in a digital repository could be audited by verifying that it can properly run a Doom demo file. The same is true of Microsoft Word or a historical document in the Word format. This is a machine-centered notion of authenticity. All well and good. However, I want to address a different authenticity today. Rather than judging authenticity in terms of playback, I'd like to ask what authenticity means for the experience of using software. Another way of putting this question is to ask what we are looking for in the reenactment of historical software use. So we need to think about historical reenactment. Now, I'm not a historical reenactor, at least not the kind you're thinking of. I've never participated in a live recreation or performance of a historical event. I have been playing historical simulations, a category of board games, for most of my life. So you might say that I'm reenacting being a military officer by staring at maps and moving cardboard units around on them. But that's not the same thing as wearing period uniforms and claiming to live the life. So anyway, I need a reenactor. In his 1998 book, Confederates in the Attic, Tony Horwitz described historical reenactment in its relationship to lived heritage. His participant journalist reportage begins at a chance encounter with a group of hardcore Confederate reenactors, Civil War reenactors. Their conversation leads Horwitz on a year-long voyage through the American South. A featured character in Confederates in the Attic is the reenactor Robert Lee Hodge, a waiter turned semi-celebrity Confederate officer. Hodges taught Horwitz the difference between hardcore and farby means casual, reenactment. He tells Horwitz about dieting to look sufficiently gaunt and malnourished, the basics of bloating to resemble a corpse on the battlefield, what to wear, what not to wear, what to eat, what not to eat, and so on. It's remarkable how little time he spends on martial basics, on actually fighting. One moment sticks out for me. During the night after a hard day of campaigning, Horwitz finds himself in the authentic situation of being wet, cold, and hungry. He lacks a blanket, so he's given basic instruction in the sleeping technique of the Confederate infantryman, spooning. The reenactor Scott Cross informs us, and actually he wrote an essay on this called The Art of Spooning, that spooning is an old term for bundling up together in bed like spoons placed together in the silver chest. Well, it makes sense. Soldiers are bunching up to keep warm and all that. So that's what Horwitz did, albeit uncomfortably. It interested me that of all the reenactment activities Horwitz describes, spooning reveals a deeper commitment to authenticity than any of the combat performances. It's uncomfortable and awkward, so it requires conscious effort. Sleep becomes self-conscious activity rather than, sleep. Since greater numbers of participants are needed for reenacting a battle than sleeping, more farbs show up, again, the casual reenactors, and thus the general level of engagement declines. During the staged battles, spectators hanging around, scripting, all kinds of confusion, accidents, they all interfere with the experience. Immersion breaks whenever dead soldiers pop up on the command, resurrect. I suspect that many farbs dressed up for battle found a hotel to sleep in. Well, specific attention to the details of daily life might be a reflection of recent historical work that emphasizes social and cultural histories of the Civil War period rather than combat histories. But that's not my takeaway. Rather, it's the standard of authenticity that goes beyond performance of a specific event such as a battle to include life experience as a whole. Horwitz recalled that, quoting him, "Between gulps of coffee, which the men insisted on drinking from their own tin cups rather than our ceramic mugs," Cool, one of the guys there, and his comrades explained the distinction. Hardcores didn't just dress up and shoot blanks. They sought absolute fidelity to the 1860s, its homespun clothing, antique speech patterns, sparse diet, and simple utensils. Adhered to properly, this fundamentalism produced a time travel high, or what hardcores called a period rush. Stephen Gapps, an Australian curator, historian and reenactor, has spoken of the extraordinary lengths reenactors go to acquire and animate the look and feel of history. Hardcore is not just about marching, shooting, and swordplay. So I wonder what a period rush might be for the experience of playing Pitfall in the mid-21st century. Shag rugs, ambient new wave radio, caffeine-free cola. Will future reenactors of historical software seek this level of experiential fidelity? Gapps again, quoting him, "Although reenactors invoke the standard of authenticity, they also understand that it is elusive, worth striving for, but never really attainable. But without the lived experience, can we achieve the specific experience of operating historical software?" Okay, reenactment then offers a take on born digital heritage that proposes this commitment to lived experience. I see some similarity here with the correspondence to lived historical experience in White's striving for discursive mimesis. Yet like media archaeology, reenactment puts performance above discourse, though it is the performance of humans rather than machines. So we now have three different ways to think about potential uses of historical software and born digital documentation. If we consider these takes as use cases, do they help us decide how to allocate resources to acquire, preserve, describe, and provide access to digital collections, such as games? Let's see. In various talks and writing about problems and opportunities of software preservation, I have described three what I call lures of software preservation over the last couple of years. These are potential pitfalls as we move from software collection to digital repositories, and from there to the researcher who requests to use a historical game in the library. What are the implications of these pitfalls for the three takes I have just given you, and what do we learn about that, about the use of historical software? Quick disclaimer before I get into this, nothing I'm about to say is intended as a criticism of any specific project. So if you think I'm criticizing anybody else, you're wrong. Okay, the first lure is the lure of the screen. This is the idea that what counts in digital media is what is delivered to the screen. This lure pops up in software preservation when we describe the essential characteristics of software artifacts in terms of surface properties such as graphics, audio, haptics, and the like. This lure of the screen is related to what media studies scholars have dubbed screen essentialism. The idea that if the significant properties of software are all surface properties, then our perception of interaction with software tells us everything we need to know. We check graphics, audio responses to our use of controllers, etc., and if they all look and act as they should, we've succeeded in preserving an executable version of historical software. Fortunately, these properties are arguably the exact properties that designers consider as the focus of user interaction. What you see, how it feels, and they're the easiest to inspect and verify directly. Well, I led the Stanford team in the 4 University Preserving Virtual Worlds project, which concluded in 2012. It was concerned with identifying significant properties of interactive game software. On the basis of several case sets and interviews with developers and other stakeholders, we concluded that isolating surface properties such as image properties, while significant for other media such as photographs, digital photographs, is not a particularly useful approach to take for game software. With interactive software, significance appears to be variable and contextual, as one would expect from a medium in which content is expressed through a mixture of design and play, procedurality and emergence. Also, it's equally important that software abstraction levels are not visible on the surface of play. It's difficult, if not impossible, to monitor procedural aspects of game design and mechanics, programming and technology by simply inspecting properties expressed on the screen or what it sounds like. Having access only to surface properties of a historical game will not make the media archaeologist very happy. Software preservation today means data migration. Access to migrated software will almost certainly occur for the researcher through emulation. I'm talking about decades from now. How do we know when our experience of historical software is affected by data migration and emulation? One answer is that we register and audit significant properties. So it is important to think about which properties to track. Of course, visual inspection of content plays a role in verifying execution by a software engine. Failure will not always be clearly indicated because the software crashes or error messages occur. It might be just that the software doesn't look right or doesn't sound right. We can never ignore surface properties altogether, but what will users think about focusing on the surface properties of games as a measure of successful preservation? The three takes I gave you compel us to think about the screen problem in different ways. First, the historian is not concerned with this problem. Her construction of a narrative mimesis invokes a selection of source materials that may or may not involve any kind of personal gameplay. On the other hand, the reenactor, as a use case, might lead repositories to fret about what the user actually sees, hears, and feels. The reenactor will push the game collection curator to think or to focus carefully on the experience occurring at the interface of user and machine, and to delve deeply into questions of significant properties and their preservation. What about media archaeology? It's unclear to me how a research site like the MAF would respond to digital preservation practices based on migration and emulation. Repositories probably cannot meet the requirements of media archaeologists without making a commitment to preservation of working historical hardware that enables playback from original media. The critique of screen essentialism is a big deal for media archaeology. I propose that it is in fact one of its core concerns. Ernst's vision of a multimedia archive is based on the idea that media archaeology moves beyond playback to reveal mechanisms of counting in the machine. Machine operation is not a surface characteristic. Ernst would argue, I think, that we will miss what the machine can tell us if all we see is the screen. So let's assign the task of accounting for machine operations to the media archaeologist. In other words, let's consider what is revealed by playback mechanisms as a research rather than as a repository problem, one that shows us how software abstraction layers below the surface can be revealed, audited, and studied. Second lure is the lure of the authentic experience. I've already said quite a bit about authenticity. So let me explain now why I'm skeptical about the authentic experience of historical software and why this is an important problem for software collections. Everyone in game or software studies knows about emulation. Emulation projects struggle to recreate an authentic experience of operating a piece of software, such as playing a game. Authenticity here means that the use experience today is like it was. It is today what it was then. The lure of the authentic experience tells digital repositories at minimum not to preserve software in a manner that would interfere with the production of such experiences. At maximum, repositories would actually deliver these authentic experiences, whether on-site or online. And that's a very tall order. In the minimum case, the repository provides software and collects hardware specifications, drivers, or support programs. The documentation that it has collected provides software and hardware specifications. Researchers use this documentation to reconstruct the historical look and feel of software to which they then have access. In the maximum case, the repository actually designs and builds access environments. Using the software authentically then would probably mean a trip to the library or to the museum that owns the historical or bespoke hardware to do this. The reading room, the library reading room then becomes the site of the authentic experience. I'm not really happy to debunk this idea of the authentic experience, but authenticity is a concept fraught not just with intellectual issues, but with registers ranging from nostalgia and fandom to immersion and fun. Those are all good things. But it's also a minefield. The first problem is perhaps an academic point, but nonetheless it's important. Authenticity is always constructed. I've been skipping my slides. Whose lived experience counts as authentic, and how has it been documented? Am I in the right place? One more. And how has it been documented? Is the best source a developer's design notes, the memory of someone who used the software when it was released, a marketing video, the researcher's self-reflexive use of the game in a library or museum? If a game was designed for kids in 1985, do you have to find a kid to play it in 2050 in order to be authentic? In the case of software with a long history, such as Breakout or Microsoft Word for a non-game, how do we account for the fact that the software was used on a variety of platforms? Do repositories have to account for all of them? For example, does the playing of Doom Deathmatch require peer-to-peer networking on a local area network, a mouse and keyboard control configuration, and a CRT display? There are documented cases of different configurations of hardware, trackballs, hacks that enabled multiplayer via TCP/IP, monitors of various shapes and sizes, and so on. Which differences matter? Matter enough for repositories to worry about them. A second problem is that the authentic experience is not always that useful to the researcher, especially the researcher studying how historical software executes under the hood. The emulated version of a software program often compensates for its lack of authenticity by offering real-time information about system states and code execution. A trade-off for losing authenticity thus occurs when the emulator shows the underlying machine operation, the counting, if you will. What questions will historians of technology, practitioners of code studies, or game scholars ask about historical software? I suspect that many researchers will be as interested in how the software works as they are in some kind of personal experience deemed authentic. As for more casual appreciation, the Guggenheim Seeing Double exhibition and Margaret Hedstrom's studies of game emulation suggest that exhibition visitors actually prefer reworked or updated experiences of historical software rather than something deemed authentic. This is not to say that original artifacts, both physical and virtual, will not be a necessary part of the research process. Access to original technology provides evidence regarding its constraints and affordances. I put this to you not as a one-size-fits-all decision, but as an area of institutional choice based on objectives and resources. The reenactor, of course, is deeply committed to the authentic experience. If all we offer is emulation, what do we say to him besides, sorry? The reality I expect is that few digital repositories will be preoccupied with delivering authentic experiences as part of their core activity. A better use of limited resources might be to validate software artifacts and contextual information provided to researchers who do the heavy lifting of reenactment themselves on a case-by-case basis. For example, Horowitz describes Robert Lee Hodge, the Civil War reenactor, as a skillful researcher who bases his performance always on historical evidence collected at places like the National Archives and the Library of Congress. Research with photographs and documents is behind his reenactments. I don't know how that figures into the spooning, but anyway. Repositories should, with apologies to Manny Ramirez, let reenactors be the reenactors. Does anyone get the Manny Ramirez reference? Anyway, consider this scenario for software reenactment. You are playing an Atari VCS game with an open source Stella emulator. It bothers you that viewing the game on your LCD display differs from the experience with a 1980s era television set. You're motivated by this realization to contribute code to the Stella project for emulating a historical display. It's theoretically possible that you could assemble everything needed to create an experience that satisfies you. An old television, adapters, an original VCS, the software, etc. Let's not worry about the shag rug or the lava lamp. You can create this personal experience on your own, then write code that matches it. My question is the result less authentic when you rely on historical documentation such as video, screenshots, technical specifications, and other evidence available in a repository to describe that original experience that you're trying to recreate than if that repository had pointed you to their own installation? I don't think it is. My point is that repositories can cooperatively support research by reenactors who create their vision of the experience. Digital repositories should consider the authentic experience as another research problem, not as a repository problem. And finally, the last lure, the lure of the executable. The lure of the executable evaluates software preservation in terms of success at building collections of software that can be executed on demand by researchers. And that, by the way, is from our own software collection, the Cabernetti collection in Green Library. Why do we collect historical software? Of course, the reason is that computers, software, and digital data have had a profound impact on virtually every aspect of recent history. What should we collect? David Behrman's answer in 1987 was the software archive. He distinguished this archive from what I will call the software library. The archive assembles documentation. The library provides historical software collections. Well, the archive was a popular choice in the early days. Margaret Hedstrom reported that attendees at the 1990 Arden Conference on the preservation of microcomputer software, which I'm sad to say I'm old enough to have attended, debated whether it was necessary to preserve software itself in order to provide a sense of touch and feel, or whether the history of software development could be documented with more traditional records. So we've been talking about this distinction between the library and the archive for a very long time. At that meeting, it was concluded that operating software is not a high priority for historical museums. That was in 1990. Again, institutional resources are not as limitless as the things we would like to do with software. Curators must prioritize among collections and services. The choice between software archive and library is not strictly binary, but choices still need to be made. I spent quite a bit of my professional life in software preservation projects. The end product of these projects is, at least in part, the library of executable historical software. So I understand the lure of the executable and the reasons that compel digital repositories to build collections of verified historical software that can be executed on demand by researchers. In some ways, this is the holy grail of digital curation with respect to software history or game history. So what could be wrong with that? As I've argued on other occasions, there are two problems, especially two problems to consider. The first is that software does not tell the user very much about how it has previously been used. In the best case, application software in its original use environment might display a record of files created by previous users. An example of that would be the list of recently opened files in Microsoft Word. You know, if you had a complete system, you could see what files had been opened in that instance. The more typical situation, however, is that software would be freshly installed from data files in the repository and thus completely lack any information about its biography, for want of a better term. How useful, in other words, will it be to install and run World of Warcraft in 2115 only to find and inhabit an empty world? The second problem, a related problem, is fundamental. Documentation that is a prerequisite for historical studies of software is rarely located in software. That might be an exception. It is more accurate to say that this documentation surrounds software in development archives, including source code, and records of use and reception. It's important to understand that this is not just a problem for historical research. Documentation is also a problem for repositories. If we don't have that information, we're not going to be able to run software when all the software engineers are gone. Well, the reenactor will want to run software. The media archaeologist will not just want access to a software library, but to original media and hardware in working order. I have to say good luck with that. Ask 100 historians, however, and I predict that at least 99 of them will be satisfied with the archive. So we still have this problem of, which use case are we going to follow in order to decide between the library and the archive. So finally, to conclude, in his book, Best Before, Video Games, Supersession, and Obsolescence, James Newman is not optimistic about software preservation. He describes how the marketing of software has in many ways made preservation a near impossibility. He's not as pessimistic, however, about game history. In a section of his book provocatively called Let Video Games Die, he argues that a documentary approach to gameplay might be a more pragmatic enterprise than the effort to preserve actually playable games. He sees this, by the way, he's going to be in our speaking series here in a couple of weeks, I think. He sees this as a shift away from conceiving of play as the outcome of preservation, to a position that acknowledges play as a part of the object of preservation. In other words, you use play to create documentation that other people will then later consult rather than themselves playing games. In other words, what happens when we give priority to recording contemporary use of software to create historical documentation of that use? Does this activity potentially reduce the need for collections and services that make it possible to use that software in the future? Historians will probably say yes, but media archaeologists and reenactors will probably be more skeptical. So, software documentation in archives or executable collections in libraries? That's the question. Is it nobler to collect documentation or to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous software installations? The case for documentation is strong. The consensus among library and museum curators, including myself, who have taken a side, is that documents from source code to screenshots are a clear win for historical studies of software. And historians will not be the only visitors to the archive. There is even a software library case to be made for archives, since successful software preservation, as I said earlier, depends on contextual documentation. Documents tell reenactors how software was used, and they can help media archaeologists figure out what they're hearing or seeing when it works. But will documentation replace the software library? This is the million-dollar question about preserving software as a part of our digital heritage. Thank you very much for your time.